and that now it is necessary for us to show some institutional courage. LSU has no doubt betrayed its students. Feeling betrayed is an entirely appropriate response to the misplaced trust students and perhaps faculty and staff to a lesser extent had in LSU as an institution and community. But this still leaves open the question of what institutional courage might be and how LSU might get some for itself. As a philosopher and an occasional ethicist, I sat down to reflect on this term. And this is, by the way, what philosophers do. They try to figure out what concepts mean from the armchair. So what does this term institutional courage mean? Can institutions have virtue? Can they have virtues like courage that we normally associate with individuals? And if so, how? So let's start by defining courage. It's one of the classic virtues and is defined as deeds that overcome justified fear for virtuous ends. Alternatively, courage is defined as continuing or persevering in doing what is right despite pain or risk. Here is courage as fortitude. So it's easy to understand how courage can apply to individual action, but again, less clear about what it means for institutions to show courage. So I came up in my reflection with at least 4 possible senses of institutional courage. These may be wrong, there may be more. And I've come to think it's a valuable concept to have at our disposal. And again, Dr. Fried is going to share her expertise on this term and how it can lead to transformation during our keynote at 3 p.m. But I wanted to kick things off by sort of offering these 4 possible senses of institutional courage as a way to orient our discussion for the beginning part of the afternoon. So let's start by recalling the political philosopher John Rawls' opening line in his book, Theory of Justice. There, Rawls writes that justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is to systems of thought. So there he suggests that virtue is in fact something that social institutions can have. In this classic context, virtues are intrinsically linked to a function or end that something has. Virtues in this broad sense are what enables something, say social institutions, like a public university, to perform their function excellently. If social institutions, for example, are intended to make us all better off, equitable distribution of goods, what Rawls called justice, is and ought to be the MO of such institutions. The particular sort of institution we at LSU are, a public institution of higher learning, a land-grant university, means that we serve a diverse set of constituents and ends, and that there will be any number, possibly, of virtues that correlate with the successful function of our institution. Research and discovery requires the virtues of inventiveness and integrity. Serving the public requires openness, change, education, inclusion, and rigor. In all cases, promoting the public good requires resisting pressure to serve private and particular ends. And this, it seems, requires some kind of institutional fortitude or resistance to temptations. I think it's easier, in fact, to define institutional courage negatively rather than positively, in relation not to virtues so much as to vices. If virtues are defined by legitimate functions and ends, institutional vices would be those properties that prevent the institution from fulfilling its social functions, or that prevent it from functioning excellently. What leads us on the path from virtue to vice? Our intellectual traditions have a few ideas on this topic. One such path from virtue to vice happens when we set up aims or ends that are foreign to the overall function of the community or institutions, ends that are ill-fitting from the point of view of established missions or from those who place their trust in the institution. Secondly, an institution as an individual might mistake or come to substitute means for ends. And this might look like making profit or revenues or even efficiency the end goal rather than the means to achieve the legitimate ends. Thirdly, we might come to neglect the whole in favor of a part, or make essential or primary what ought to be secondary. In this case, placing athletics above academics, which is undoubtedly a major issue at LSU, is an example. These sorts of substitutions or deviations lead us away from our honorable mission. We are a public land-grant university dedicated to producing hope, prosperity, social benefit for all the people of Louisiana. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And in this context, what is required and hoped for is that we can muster and activate the institutional resources that are necessary to set us back on course when we go astray. Institutional courage might then be something like a capacity to resist this sort of institutional corruption, to stay true to mission. And institutional courage would then be what is required to be a self-correcting institution. If we were to agree on that definition, one of the contemporary factors that prevent institutional courage is the crowding out of moral language, the language of right and wrong, for a language of risk or risk management. Risk can come to trump right. Institutional correction entails self-criticism. It involves admitting to failure and apologizing to those harmed by these failures. This involves making the institution vulnerable legally and morally to the ones harmed and making the institution responsible for repairing the harm. But all of this, in many cases, is prohibited by risk management thinking. One often hears around here, therefore, that we must do even better, but rarely enough have we heard we have done grievous wrong. Institutional risk, the threat, say, of lawsuits, I think, can and does also function as a cover or excuse for the institutional rewards that attend going along with corruption rather than blowing the whistle on abuse and institutional failure. Institutional courage then would involve both resisting the substitution of risk talk for rights talk, but it also would involve grappling with the paradoxical ways that worries about institutional risk come to be an alibi for tolerating unacceptable levels of risk. Finally, it's my closing section. Michel Foucault in a set of late lectures on the Greek term parousia, which can be translated as courageous truth-telling, notes that what organically linked truth-telling to courage in the ancient context was the risk that faced the truth-teller. The Parisiatic figure always has legitimate concerns. Courage in speech requires an asymmetry between speaker and authority. One can speak truth to power only in the case where one lacks power in some relevant respect. In this sense, courageous speech is rarely on the side of the institution and almost always on the side of the ones trying to make visible what the institution would prefer to see hidden. It is genuinely hard, therefore, to institutionalize parousia, though the institution of tenure is often touted as just such a success story. Unfortunately, as we can see in our own case here at LSU, a robust tenured faculty, more or less robust, has been no guarantee of institutional courage. We are indeed far from the days when one could plausibly declare, as did Isidore Rabi, interrupting then president of Columbia University, Dwight Eisenhower, "Mr. President, we are not employees of the university. We are the university." Power and authority at the university no longer rest, if they ever did, with faculty self-governance. This does not mean that tenured faculty do not have an obligation to speak truth to power. They do. It is just insufficient for institutional courage of the sort required. In this sense, and here is my final suggestion, a courageous institution could only be one where power is vested with those most invested in the excellent function of the institution. People like our panelists here with us today. In any case, I want to end on an even more sobering note without claiming any particular courage in speaking these words. The only woman among the 8 finalists for the position of president of the university withdrew her application today, according to NOLA.com. How is it possible, in the wake of the sort of institutional failures that we have been witness to, failures that have disproportionately harmed women at the university, that we do not have a single woman being considered for the position of the next president? This is what institutional failure looks like. It seems to me that in response to this state of affairs, the rage should be deafening. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dean of the Honors College, Jonathan Earl, who will introduce our panelists and moderate the ensuing discussion. Thank you so much for being here and for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldgaber, for organizing this outstanding afternoon. for the LSU Ethics Institute's virtual spring summit on institutional courage. It's a great topic, and I thought your remarks were perfect, and I count myself as one of the enraged. Here's a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to introduce our very distinguished panel all at once and in the order in which I got their bios. Then I'm going to let them have a chance, if they choose to say some remarks that they may or may not have prepared, or they can speak off the cuff. And then I'm going to open it up for all of the people who have joined us virtually this afternoon to ask questions of our panel in the chat function. So I think you're all very familiar with this after 14 months of our new lives on Zoom. But please, I think you probably heard this a million times, please be respectful, even if you are passionate in your agreement or disagreement. If you are not respectful and professional, we have the right to mute you or make you leave our Zoom. And I've been on some really wonderful Zooms that have unfortunately been bombed by, I just assume, terrible people. So let's keep this professional and respectful to all of our panelists who have given of their time. Really quickly though, I do want us to speak briefly about what a critical juncture this is for our, I guess, planet, country, state, and university. We're at a pivotal moment where I think we have to look deep within ourselves and figure out what institutional virtue is and how we can get more of it. So I appreciate Dr. Goldgaber endeavoring to define those terms. I think we're going to get some other definitions. And I really do think it's actually a crisis of virtue in the philosophical sense. And as a historian of the early American Republic, I can just say this: the people who founded this country had no answer for what would happen to us if we lacked public virtue. It doesn't work being in a republic if we don't have courage and virtue and those things going for us. When we're coming out of a time when, literally the leader of our country was about the least virtuous person I can imagine. Whether or not he was successful or a good leader or a good politician, I'll leave that to you to decide for yourselves. He was not a man of virtue, not really a man of the kind of virtue we're talking about today. So maybe we can start with that. But meanwhile, I will introduce our panel in the order in which I got their bios. Very distinguished panel. Many of them are, if not my personal friends, people I follow on the Twitter. So it's great to see you virtually here and to hear from you this afternoon. Dr. Pam Monroe is director of LSU's School of Social Work and an alumni professor of Child and Family Studies. In 3 decades at LSU, Dr. Monroe held a faculty appointment in the School of Human Ecology and administrative appointments as the associate dean of the graduate school and interim dean of the School of Social Work. She also worked for 4 years as a policy analyst and helped staff the Health and Welfare Committee of Louisiana's House of Representatives. Her research expertise is in public policy, specifically welfare programs and poverty, and she is an alum of the Ethics Institute training program and has successfully infused the training on moral frameworks into her undergraduate teaching. She holds degrees from Francis Marion College in South Carolina, where she grew up, a master's in family studies and family counseling at Kentucky, and a PhD in child and family development at the University of Georgia. Next, joining us this afternoon is my former colleague, Jerry Ceppos, who has worked in journalism and journalism education for more than 50 years. He was executive editor at the San Jose Mercury News and vice president for the Knight Ridder newspaper chain, at the time the second largest in the country. Later, he became dean of the Reynolds School of Journalism at the University of Nevada, Reno, and dean of LSU's Manship School of Mass Communication. He's now William B. Dickinson Distinguished Professor at the Manship School, where he teaches media ethics and other issues. He was one of 3 recipients of the first Ethics in Journalism Award at the National Society of Professional Journalists. LSU Press this summer is publishing his edited volume covering politics in the age of Trump. Next up will be Dr. David Stamps, an assistant professor in the Manship School of Mass Communication. His research focuses on interpersonal engagement among racialized minorities, representation of marginalized groups in mass media, and the impact of mass media imagery on audience members. Specifically, Dr. Stamps' research is aimed at understanding the psychological and behavioral effects of identity-focused interpersonal interactions, as well as audiences' exposure to and engagement with mass media, including digital, news, and entertainment media. Inherent in his conceptualization of this work is recognition that issues of class, gender, race, ability, geographic location, and sexuality meaningfully impact these relationships. Bob Mann holds the Manship Chair at the Manship School of Mass Communication at LSU. He is the author of critically acclaimed political histories of the US Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, President Ronald Reagan, and he's currently working on a book about Huey Long's involvement with LSU. Before joining the faculty in 2006, Mann worked as a journalist and spent more than 20 years in the political arena, serving 3 US senators and a Louisiana governor. He was a communications director to Louisiana Governor Kathleen Babineau Blanco after serving 19 years as a Senate aide. He was state director to US Senator John Monroe of Louisiana and served as Monroe's press secretary. And he also served as press secretary to Senator Russell Long. He was press secretary for the 1990 re-election campaign of US Senator J. Bennett Johnston of Louisiana and the 1998 Monroe re-election campaigns and 2003 Blanco campaign. His memoir of his years in politics, Backrooms and Bayous, My Life in Louisiana Politics, will be published in August. And finally, Dr. Monique Fondren-Cain serves as Director of Information Systems and Security Services for Residential Life at LSU. She's also an adjunct faculty member for the College of Human Sciences and Education and teaches in the areas of higher education and educational technology. In addition, Dr. Cain was elected to serve 2 terms as the LSU Black Faculty and Staff Caucus President for the 2018 through 2022 term. She has worked at LSU for over 20 years. She's a proud first-generation college student with degrees in information systems and decision sciences, an MPA, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Educational Leadership and Research, with emphases in higher education and a minor in public administration, all from LSU. Her passion for education, leadership, technology, quest for knowledge, and eagerness to improve student success in post-secondary education comes with research on first-generation and low-income students. I did not know this about Dr. Cain. She and her husband own and operate the Hilltop Barbershop in Old South Baton Rouge. It's a really distinguished panel. I'm honored to be moderating with you today. And I think that means, Dr. Monroe, you are up.
Thank you. When I was contacted to serve on this panel, I pushed back because I've made no formal study of the topic of institutional courage, which will immediately become apparent to you in my comments. But after some reflection, I thought about my firmly held belief, something I very often say, that we are wrong to love institutions, that we should invest our love into people, not only, but primarily, we love our pets, and that an institution is comprised of people, and that as a human developmental scientist for 40 years, I know a few things about how people develop. So I will start there. Theories of human development and decades of related research establish that humans develop in fairly predictable ways, not in determinative fashion, always as individuals and always in the context of their environment. We develop physically. I have a little granddaughter whose first birthday is today, and I understand to a fine detail her motor development. We develop cognitively, intellectually, so it is a great joy to watch little children discover and understand the world, to watch their minds and their language develop. But human developmental theorists tell us we develop morally, our moral character as well. This development also moves through a toddler-like stage of simple understanding of right and wrong to a more decentered stage where we begin to have empathy for others, even to the point that we may sacrifice self for others, and where we begin to examine great moral issues in society and in our institutions. Humans with secure attachment are bonded to other humans in a healthy way, but also in ways that help us develop social skills like awareness of the needs and emotions of others, recognizing the feelings of others, having compassion, and controlling ourselves out in society. These social skills may be brought into our institutions and workplace as well. Just like we can choose to tend to our intellect or not, we can choose to develop further our minds or be satisfied with a somewhat average intellectual life. We choose whether to develop higher moral thinking. Most of us have that capacity to choose. Higher moral thinking beyond the basic sense of right and wrong, beyond a calculation of the likelihood of getting caught and the punishments that would follow if I do get caught, or questions of what's in it for me. It takes intention, dedication, and effort to develop ourselves morally to the point that we have what I would today call individual moral courage. Strong moral development means we are motivated towards something beyond just ourselves, that we want a better community, society, or workplace for all. We want equity, fairness, and justice. We want a level playing field, and we want accountability. It's very messy. It's not easy. Moral courage means that we are willing to pursue this even at some risk to ourselves and to our individual standing. We may risk being shunned or isolated, ridiculed, sanctioned, loss of status, or even suffer the loss of a job. Moral courage also implies a willingness to rise above complacency or indifference. For me personally, it is a challenge to rise above cynicism. For example, in the situation in which we find ourselves at LSU, I am disgusted by and have been vocal about the plain fact that there are two sets of rules, rules for the powerful and rules for the rest of us. This duality exists in many institutions, and it is hard for me personally not to be cynical about it and just walk away in disgust. But an assault on one of us is an assault to the body, to the community. It is not for love of a cold institution, but love of my students, love of my colleagues, and the beloved community, that I tamp down that cynicism and invest energy in speaking out. I do it also because I know that my students, mostly young women, are watching me and depend upon me to model moral courage as an example for their own personal development. Finally, let me say a word about having the moral courage to speak out. I also see speaking out as a form of privilege. Many people bite their tongue because the risks simply are too high and their personal stake in the outcome is fairly low. I have the privilege of rank, seniority, institutional memory, personal financial security, and race. If we have learned anything over the recent past, it is that our privilege, my privilege, must be placed into the service of victims and the oppressed if we are going to dismantle injustice. To my mind, it is a combination of moral courage, personal integrity, and the responsible use of my privilege that compels me to confront my institution, LSU, and demand change. I have done so on many occasions in my 33 years at LSU, most often in ways that draw no attention to myself, but with an aim toward correcting injustices and restoring integrity to this institution. LSU is an institution, but it is a collective of human individuals. I suggest that if institutions are not comprised of individuals with highly developed moral courage, that institution will at some point find itself in trouble. And in fact, that's where we find ourselves today. Imagine a university without individuals committed to their highest level of intellectual development. Now imagine a university without individuals committed to their highest level of moral development, including the moral courage to act and to speak out in the face of great institutional failing. This is the crossroads at which we now find ourselves. Thank you very much. And Jerry, I'll hand it off to you.
Let me unmute. I should know how to do that by now. Thank you very much. Dr. Goldgaber's terminology about risk talk versus right talk is exactly correct in my mind. And I think I see a solution to that apparent head-on collision of values. And it's really very simple. What we need to do is to abandon the secrecy that we have somehow given to institutions through law, through common practice, and really just through the institution's ability to bully us, because so many of them are more, dare I say, more elite than we are. The situation at LSU is a perfect example, but I have to say it's not the only example of institutions being bullies by being secret about everything. Institutions that depend on secrecy are all over the place. Police agencies, the rest of government, nonprofits, not just LSU at all. But the LSU situation really comes to mind because everything that LSU, almost everything that LSU has done has been driven by secrecy. In fact, we didn't know what little we know now just a very few months ago. For example, we didn't know that the former football coach had been ordered to stop mistreating female student workers. We didn't know that because 3 members of the LSU Board of Supervisors were sworn to secrecy by their lawyers, and that secret lasted for 8 years. Isn't that unbelievable? We didn't know that the same football coach reportedly agreed to a settlement with a student he had mistreated. We didn't know that because the settlement was secret. We didn't know that the Board of Supervisors ordered King Alexander to come to a secret dinner in which he was ordered to fire the athletic director, a state employee. We still don't know why LSU suspended the chancellor of the LSU Medical School in Shreveport 2 weeks ago because LSU won't tell us. Now think about this. If a Baton Rouge cop had been suspended for 2 weeks, wouldn't the police department be under some pressure to explain why? Well, this happens to be a man who treats patients. You could argue a more, I don't know, important person than a police officer. But the patients haven't been told why he's suspended. And of course, the most fun example, as you know, LSU yesterday and today interviewed candidates for the presidency of the university. But get this, we don't even know if LSU is looking for a single president, as it had under King, or whether it's looking for a president and chancellor as it used to have. How is that possible? Well, a few weeks ago, the chair-elect of the Board of Supervisors told an advocate reporter that the full board had voted to have one person in charge. But a short while later, the chair-elect of the board said he had a correction. Actually, he didn't know if there had been a vote on the issue. So I guess that's not secrecy, it's incompetence, or it's not having minutes of a meeting. But whatever it is, it's the same as secrecy because constituents aren't being told the truth. Are we looking for a president? I have no idea. Are we looking for a president and chancellor? No idea. Isn't that unbelievable? That secrecy is why I think institutions fail at institutional courage. Very briefly, there is one second factor that could be called arrogance or elitism or being out of touch with the average person. This was written about in the Advocate editorial page today. As a result of the original investigation at LSU, a grand total of 2 employees received brief suspensions. Excuse me. After an uproar about that very light punishment for a serious violation of Title IX rules, one of the 2 was told last weekend that he has received an additional punishment. He can't go to football games this fall. That is his additional punishment. I think I'm probably going to ask him if I can have his tickets, but it still doesn't seem like much of a punishment to me. By the way, he earns $500,000 a year. The reaction of regular people to that kind of punishment is not what LSU expected. Around town, people are laughing uproariously about this tough punishment. But through arrogance or indifference or elitism or something, LSU is surprised by that reaction, and I don't think it should be. Thank you.
I think I'm up.
You're up, David.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Stamps. I'm an assistant professor. I'm going to be honest with you. I had notes ready. My other computer crashed. Here I am. We're going to just see what happens. Whenever I walk into a classroom, whenever I give a talk in any way, shape, fashion, or form, and I'm allowed to, I always start the conversation making note of my identities because they matter, especially in spaces like this when we're talking about courage. And so I come to you with the identities that you see. I am Black, I'm cis, and then I'm an educator, I'm an activist, I'm a researcher, and then there are those that you don't see. I'm a partner and a parent. And all of those identity matters. One that really matters in this space is that I'm an assistant professor, so I don't have tenure. So I exist in a vulnerable space all the time. And I'm gonna go one step further. I am on a panel of highly esteemed folks who I adore, one of whom was a previous dean and has a vote on if I will have my contract extended and or get offered tenure, and another who was not only has the same privilege, but is on the board of tenure and promotion in my school. So when I talk about courage, folks, you are looking at it right here, because if you don't know me, and you will know me within the next 10 minutes, I will always speak the truth, job be damned. And so when I was asked to speak, I went back to the individual who asked and said, are you sure? Because as much as I love my job and I love what I do, I love justice and equity more. I love freedom more. I love for each and every one of us to see ourselves fully and wholly and unapologetically in every single space more. So if I lose my job seeking those things, I'm okay with it. But what that means is it takes courage. And in this space, institutional courage is the focus. And so I bring it up because I decided to define institutional courage solely and selfishly in my own way. And I look at it as the denial of respectability and the denial of assimilation to institutional culture. That means that we should be able to go into any institution, LSU being one example, and be fully seen, heard, and welcomed in such a way that we are valued and we know we fully matter. But we all know that that's not the case in most institutions. And I'll be honest with you, in LSU, a prime example of one in which that doesn't happen. Again, I told you I'm gonna speak my truth, but the truth is that my identities, as much as they matter to me, are not valued in our institution. Oftentimes they're tokenized, but they don't automatically get embraced. And I'm just gonna be honest with each and every one of you because I think this space requires that. I didn't know that at LSU, the Black and brown faculty are only roughly 3%. 3%. Baton Rouge, Black and brown folks are the majority. In Louisiana, they're over 35%. So as a state institution, we don't reflect the state. I'm gonna call that out because that takes some institutional courage to be real about the fact that we don't respect and replicate the place in which we serve every single day. So from that standpoint alone, I know for a fact that the curriculum and the folks who are seen across campus and the ways in which we engage with critical thought isn't happening to its fullest extent. Am I on board to making that a reality? Absolutely. But I already told you, I don't have the social capital. And the folks who make decisions can decide that they like my face, but they don't like what's coming out of my mouth. It takes institutional courage to have that conversation and to say it out loud. The reality is, for some of us, institutional courage is a privilege. I was having dinner with a colleague of mine, and she said to me, I like that you call things out. I could never do that. And I said, that's okay. And she said, well, how do you do it? And I was like, I don't have an answer for you. I have nothing to lose. I grew up poor, Black in Ferguson. And if that's where I end up, then so be it. But I cannot, for the life of me, not exercise courage in these spaces, and rightly so, acknowledge that some of us don't have the privilege to exercise courage when it would do us or put us in a position of success, Or we may have the tools and the privilege, but that's such a foreign concept to be courageous and outspoken that we don't even know how to step into that space. And so to give space for those individuals equally matters. But what that means is we have to find a way to do better. We have to find a way to uphold those who don't have a lot. We have to find a way to create space for those who are timid and make it okay to be fully seen and heard. I believe that when each and every one of us, no matter our identities, have the courage to stand up and speak out against injustice, to stand up and speak out so that everyone can be seen and safe, that we'll actually get to this space that we laud, but hasn't become a reality of what society is supposed to be. But that takes courage. And some of us have it and all else be damned. Some of us don't know what it means. And some of us have the privilege and I have to exercise it. And that's just the truth. I'll give you one more example. My computer crashed, so I lost my talking points, and my phone also died because I was at the House committee meeting, so I don't know what the timer is. But last thing I'll share with you. School ended last week, and I made the conscious decision that every single semester, every single class I teach, and I'll be teaching over in Honors College in the fall, so look forward to that. We will always end the semester talking about equity and inclusion and liberation. We'll use our standpoint as scholars who have this unique positionality to be change makers, to be trailblazers, to look at communities that aren't in these spaces, whether they were not allowed in these spaces, whether or not they don't have the tools to be in these spaces, whether they don't want to be in these spaces. What does it mean to be college educated, as my students who will be, and I am as well, to think about all of our communities, not just the ones that are respectable, not just the ones that uphold a certain idea of what it means to be American, but I'm talking about migrants and sex workers and dope boys, you name it. What does it mean to advocate for everyone to be seen and heard? And so in every single class I teach, no matter what the subject matter is, we talk about those different identities, those different communities, those different cultures, and how we can take what we've learned over the past 14 and a half weeks and make it applicable to those communities, because that's how we become thoughtful global citizens. Y'all, it takes courage to do that because my students are comfortable. And who am I to challenge them to think holistically about people who don't look like them? In their mind, the entire world are 20-year-old white kids who are playing flip cup and going to football games. How dare you make me think about the two-spirited indigenous individual from Dakota? How dare you? It takes institutional courage to push and lean on them so that iron can sharpen iron. And so I share that with you because last week, I slept for almost 13 hours after giving those 2 lectures because it takes the courage to get to engage and it wears you out. Every student that had a question, I was waiting for them to come from me. I was waiting for them to be abrupt. I'll be honest, the way we're having mass shootings, I was ready to die. Because when you challenge someone, when you take that courageous step, for some of us, especially for some of us who are Black, it's life or death. But what I found was that my students had thoughtful questions and they had kind of queries that I didn't even think about. I had some students say, well, we didn't talk about the prison population. And I was like, and you're right, because Louisiana has the largest incarcerated population. Let's talk about that community. They engaged. They were thinking about all of the tools in their toolkit that I intentionally put there over the last 14 weeks and were forced to consider now, how do you make society better? How do you make communities that don't look like you receive equitable resources and representation? And it took courage to have the conversation, and it took all of my students' courage to meet me halfway and thoughtfully engage. And so my last point was, what does it take for us to get there? For a lot of us, it takes this unique opportunity to step out on courage, knowing that we may be met with other people who are timid, but they may actually get on the stage with us and demonstrate courage as well. I have been fortunate to be here 2 years fresh out of a PhD program. And without the social capital and the tenure that could position me to be more courageous and outspoken, I'm going to exercise it now. Because folks who look like me and those of you who don't get this unique opportunity to see what courage looks like. So maybe, just maybe, you will exercise it on behalf of folks who don't look like you and who don't have the same lived experience, or for those that do. LSU is going through a lot right now. A new president, several failed searches, Title IX. We got a lot going on. This is the moment to be courageous for our students, for our alumni, for our parents, for our colleagues, for those of us who have been disenfranchised. Your Black and brown colleagues are not okay. I am tired of watching bodies die every day. And I am concerned that I am next because my PhD won't save me. Courage is acknowledging that and for each of you to check in on one another. This is that moment where courage is called for and being moderate is not enough. So I'll do it to the day I die and we'll see what happens. If I'm here a year from now, surprise, surprise. But the reality is I'm hoping that you see it and realize it's not that hard to do once you pull off the Band-Aid, because what we need right now is more courageous folks. Thank you.
Great job, David. I appreciate very much this opportunity to participate in the discussion today. It's on an important topic, especially at this point in the school's history. And speaking of history, I would like to use my brief time this afternoon to bring just a little bit of historical perspective to this discussion. I'm repeating what we already know, but I think it should be said. In the last few months, we've all learned a lot about the appalling behavior of senior officials at LSU. And although we probably only know a tenth of what we will know a year from now, what we do know about the handling of sexual abuse allegations by officials at the highest levels of this institution, including in the athletic department, is just horrifying. This institution was not willing to protect the young people entrusted to its care. It betrayed and it continues to betray these young people because many of the people running LSU regard protecting themselves or the football program as the priority. In most cases, this conduct was not just the result of a lack of courage. I think it was also badly misplaced priorities, self-protection, and where I really want to take this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of this institution. As Jonathan said earlier, I'm working on a book about Huey Long and LSU, and I've been working on this book for over a year, and that research has helped inform my views of this current scandal. I might not have seen it so clearly before, but I do now. LSU's unwillingness to deal with this scandal in an honest and transparent way is a symptom of almost a century of over-politicizing this university. Since the early 1930s, LSU has not been so much an institution dedicated to the state's betterment, but rather a tool of the state's political class. In the late 1930s, the state's politicians milked this university dry and almost bankrupted LSU in a scandal that resulted in dozens of indictments. The president of LSU, James Monroe Smith, and the governor, Dick Lesh, went to prison for their crimes, along with a number of other university officials and political leaders. From that time until today, in varying degrees, many of the politicians down at the state capitol have not seen LSU for what it should be, the state's flagship institution with enormous potential for the social and economic revival of Louisiana. Rather, they see it as a cash cow to be milked or a sports program to be exploited, or as we saw yesterday, a sports program to bask in the light of. Service on the LSU Board of Supervisors has been reserved for big donors, mostly white, male business leaders and lawyers, or in the case of the current board, the children of those big donors. Experience in higher education is not valued, nor is it desired by governors from Huey Long to John Bell Edwards. The main qualification for service on the LSU board is a fat wallet and a willingness to contribute to the winning candidate for governor. From Huey Long until today, LSU has also been a foundation of the state's white supremacy and male patriarchy. I spent a good part of the last year looking at gumbos from the 1920s through the 1940s, and I never saw a black face. And it reminds me every time I look at it how much this institution has contributed to the white supremacy that still exists in the state and the lost opportunity that this university created for so many hundreds of thousands of young people in the state who never had a chance to come here and still don't. LSU has never had anyone as president or chancellor who was not a white man. And even during a scandal in which the issue of the abuse of women is at the center, this is not likely to change. As I speak right now, The LSU Board's search committee on the other side of campus is into its second day of Zoom interviews of candidates for the president's job, and not one of the 7 finalists is a woman. LSU's board has rarely had many women or African American members. Even today, only 3 women serve on the board. Last month, the number was 2, which was 1 more than Bobby Jindal had appointed, until the embarrassment of the situation forced Governor Edwards to find another woman, ironically the daughter of one of his donors and political friends. In almost every way for decades, LSU has thrived or foundered based on the whims of the governor and the legislature. Our appropriations slashed and our ability to generate revenue restricted severely by the legislature, we're beholden to the state's political class to a degree unmatched by most, if not all, state higher education institutions in the country. In other words, LSU is not just an institution without courage. It is an institution designed by the leadership of the state to be completely lacking in courage. Its cowardice and timidity around moral issues is not a bug, but a feature. LSU is morally bankrupt because that's how the state's political leadership wants it to be. And it has been thus since the days before the Louisiana scandals in 1939. We can spend all day talking about how to instill a different culture in this place. But I worry we'll waste our time until we talk seriously about how the state's culture, how Louisiana's culture, and Louisiana's politics infect and influence this place. The racism, the sexism, the disregard for the well-being of students, especially women, the worship of sports over academia, the suspicion and even disdain for education in our population, the disregard and hostility towards science, all that and more is holding this institution back. Thank you for this opportunity to share my views, and I look forward to the discussion continuing today.
I guess it's my turn. David almost ran out of here and did like a high five and a shout. You know, you always get me. So thank you so much, and to the other panelists as well for your words. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here today with this wonderful panel and all the great minds and hearts on the call. I want to begin with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. He once said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." I hold this quote to be true each day as I represent the Black Faculty and Staff Caucus and collaborate with other affinity groups. Before I get into the thick of this, though, I want to express that as I speak with you today, I speak with you through my multiple identities, especially through my lens as a Black woman. This frames my experiences, my thoughts, and everything that I share with you today. I also speak from the collective voices of our Black Faculty and Staff Caucus. If you know me, you know I assert to be professional, kind, and direct in everything that I do. Having compassion, kindness, and empathy with everyone that we meet and hearing their stories and truth should be the foundation to cultivate an environment conducive to encourage and promote institutional courage. So we want to talk about institutional courage. You've heard the definitions today. You know, what does it look like? Well, I'm with David. You are looking at a living, breathing example of institutional courage and resilience, and without tenure. It's not easy to sit in front of you today and tell you my truth. Although this is not my first rodeo, I can feel blank stares, silent voices, the looks of, oh my goodness, here Monique goes again. It's not easy to allow yourself to be vulnerable and share personal details of stories that cause excessive emotional strain. And in my case, and many other cases of the Black faculty and staff, we are experiencing the heaviness of constant racial battle fatigue. I also see the tears and hear the stories of Black faculty and staff who feel their voices will never be heard at the institutional level to truly effectuate change. And our allies, accomplices, and advocates, I love you. Their voices that scream, please say it again. We support you. I am here. It is those voices of silent victims of oppression, inequity, and resilience that give me the courage to continue to speak truth to power. It is those collective voices that give me institutional courage to be here today with all of you. Our Black faculty and staff are people with institutional courage and resilience against all odds. We get up every day with courage, hope, and a smile as we deal with systemic racism, microaggressions, pay inequity. And goodness knows what else is going on in our lives, plus COVID. What? It's the pouring out of my soul each day. Every time I speak, to make Black stories and experience told, heard, and counted, I pour my soul out. It is the stories of the Black faculty, staff, and students that I carry with me to each meeting, discussion panel, side conversation, and all of the classes that I teach. By the way, I teach many LSU online classes, so my students are non-traditional. It's the faces of our Black students that I see and their actions against racism, injustice, and all forms of oppression that give me hope. The Black Faculty and Staff Caucus will not let them do this by themselves. It is our constant courage and applied pressure from all angles that we will effectuate change, come hell or high water. As I sit here today talking to you, I'm tired, I'm worn, and invisible labor continues. But I remain motivated and encouraged by the pushing and pressing of our Black Faculty and Staff Caucus, both collectively and individually. Thank you for your service today at the Capitol, Dr. Stamps. Our allies, accomplices, and advocates who stand in the throes of the fight with us, my family, my friends, and our amazing students. When I say amazing students, I mean amazing students. They give me strength to get up and do this important, impactful work each and every day. But in the same breath, I cannot do this alone. We as Black faculty and staff cannot do this alone. We need to move beyond the red tape and pushing papers alone to say we're doing something. And what is perceived as is the smoke and mirrors dance. We need campus executive leadership, administrators, deans, directors, and associate to assistant level management to have the courage to make the tough decisions and create an environment conducive to institutional courage. This is the way. As the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion is seen through various advancement pillars like diversity roadmap and the new Civil Rights and Title IX office, I am encouraged in the direction. However, there are still so many unaddressed disparities. We have to cook with all the pots on the stove without burning anything. That came from me. But one funny thing is I'm the queen of LSU fall fact brochures. I literally have a dozen on my desk. I think the furthest I go through is 2009, but the other day I was looking at the fall 2009 issue and noticed there were 47 Black faculty listed in contrast to 1,034 white faculty listed at LSU in 2009. I then flipped to the current fall 2020 issue, only to see, not to my surprise at all, that there were now only 61 Black faculty listed in contrast to the 937 white faculty at LSU. Don't even get me started on the other underrepresented groups of faculty. I won't even say those numbers. I'll let you go look them up yourself. We're always celebrating our ever increasing student diverse population, but our faculty numbers remain stagnant. Can you imagine what it would be like if students, faculty, and staff from diverse backgrounds were all celebrated and valued? What would those faculty and staff numbers look like? You say. We have to do better. We must have the institutional courage to break out of the ranks of old thinking and trying to make it fit into our new agenda of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to retain, recruit, and significantly increase Black faculty and staff on our campus, in our university system as a whole, on all levels. We must press to change unfair and unequitable policies, procedures, and practices. These must not just be discussions and proposals that are currently sitting on people's desks. Administrators, executive leadership, unit heads, department heads, middle management, I can go on, must make radical changes to shake, stir, make anew the experiences and opportunities to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we're doing is not working. So let us make intentional and radical progress to break these chains of inequity. We need to hold people accountable for their actions and inaction. As much fear and institutional courage that we have to make LSU a more inclusive, compassionate, and fair environment, the people that do not want this need to know that they have no place at LSU with backwards thinking and practices. How is institutional courage possible, you say? Speak up, people. Your silence is complicity. We need our white colleagues to not only stand with us, but fight these battles with us and help push leaders and decision makers to effectuate the change that is needed. I know this is scary sometimes, but join me. Do it scared. You don't think I'm scared? Do it scared. We need you to be accomplices with us and advocates for us. We need you to stand in solidarity against racism and all forms of injustice and oppression. Have courage, have humanity, have the audacity to dream, hope, and change our campus, our community, and our world. I'll stop and I will leave you with another quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Thank you for your time today, and get some courage.
Thank you, Dr. Cain, and the rest of our panelists. Everyone did a great job. They stayed in their time. They inspired, they asked great questions. And now is a chance for you all who are participants to put some questions for them in the chat. I will curate those questions. And I think I'll start off one of my own. Our keynoter who's gonna speak later this afternoon, Dr. Fried, put some book suggestions in the chat if you wanna look. And I'm gonna actually start this question, which is based on her work from a couple of years ago, where she has a David Letterman top 10 list on ways to promote institutional courage. I'm gonna kind of throw out 4 of them, and I would love to hear some panelists reflect. One of them is right at what Dean Ceppos mentioned in his remarks. It's be transparent in data and policy as an institution. Another one is to bear witness, be accountable, and apologize. The third one I want to kind of throw out there is comply with laws and go beyond mere compliance. Beware a risk management approach. And I think that's something that we can all see our university do all too often. And then finally, the one that I want to throw out there is use the organization to address the societal problem. So I'm going to kind of throw that out there for your reflection while I wait for other better questions.
I'll talk a little bit about being transparent and some of the things that the caucus and the diversity roadmap are trying to work on. Transparency is everything. We don't need any more secrets. And even to me, the secret of the demographics of LSU is a secret. So we have put into place a proposal that is already at HR that we want a outward-facing, public-facing webpage that shows LSU demographics. I want to see race, gender. I want to see all of those things that show people who we are, because speak truth to power. I mean, you're putting all these students, oh, we're so diverse, we're so diverse. You have this many Black folk here. And that 61 number that I said earlier includes part-time and full-time faculty. And you should see, when you start breaking it down in the faculty ranks, a professor, associate professor, an assistant professor, it'll make you throw up. It's a shame. But guess what? If that's our truth, we need to speak it.
Can I add to that, that I think that was beautiful, Monique, and I would add to that, that I think that this university, when you talk about Jonathan bearing witness, we need to bear witness to the role that this university's played in what I call the white supremacist foundation that this university was and still is in many ways. It was not until 1954 that the first African-American student was enrolled at LSU. A.P. Toro Jr. lasted about 6 weeks before he was run off the campus by the hostility of students and faculty. And then it was another 10 years before Black undergraduates were welcomed onto this campus. I think we need to acknowledge, I think this university needs to acknowledge the mountain of lost prosperity in this state because Black students weren't allowed here. And the mountain of lost opportunity in this state because Black students were banned from this place for generations and generations and generations. This is not just something that, as much as I want us to see do what Monique is saying, I think we have so much in our past that we need to repent for. And I don't mean, you and me and the others. I mean, we weren't there in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, but this institution contributed to the lack of prosperity by a big part of this state, and we've never really, I don't think, really acknowledged that. We started to do some things on this campus, like take Troy Middleton's name off the library, and we've changed the name of Raphael Sims Boulevard or whatever it was. But we've got so much more work to do, and I just don't think we're doing it.
I hear you. Other comments on what I tossed out? And I still am waiting for questions in the chat, folks.
I'll be super brief. And Jonathan, if I got this wrong, please correct me, because you mentioned, I think the third point was this idea of to comply or compliance. And if I heard that correctly, I'm a resounding no. I'm just going to be honest. Bob did a great job. Did a great job of articulating some of the history of who we are. So sometimes doing things the way that they've always been done just for the sake of tradition is trash. Sometimes we need to cause good trouble and not comply, but shake it up. That's the courage that's actually needed to move us forward. A lot of my research looks at what drives collective action. It means it's pushing back against this idea of complying with systems that create inequities. I don't want anyone that I do life with to think, just do it because it's how it's always been done, or keep your head down and don't shake it up, because then I slowly die inside. And no one deserves that. So this idea of the institution, if you just comply, you'll be okay, isn't true for a lot of us, isn't true for most of us. One thing that I'm heartened by and that I'm hurting by, that I really want to see more of, is just diversity for the sake of diversity. I can't, on one hand, count the number of Latinx or Indigenous faculty that I encounter. Where are their experiences? Where are our trans students who get a chance to see themselves? Where are our panels that reflect multiple intersectional identities? We have to call it out, and not for the sake of slow growth, demand it. That means that if we have to knock on doors for the admin and not be respectable and comply, so be it. But the truth is, this place will never live up to its full potential if we're gonna be comfortable with just watching paint dry. It's 2021. You don't get to show up and now be excited because you took a racist name off the library. It's 2021. We were moving past that decades ago. So if we're going to be arguably aggressive towards what it means for LSU to be competitive in the marketplace, then we're going to have to uproot some of the issues, and compliance is going to be one of them. This idea of just doing things because they were done historically means that there'll be another 30, 40, 50, 100 years before this place actually looks like the society and the state that we represent.
All right, I do have some questions. Dr. Reams asked a question about addressing educational disparities and what the role maybe of the university's own lab school or perhaps our own College of Human Sciences and Education could play in improving our institutional courage. Anyone want to speak on that?
Well, I will say from the perspective of the School of Social Work, and I'm not a social worker, I'm privileged to be the leader of the School of Social Work. We have taken a really top to bottom approach in the past year to do a complete audit examination of our documents, our practices, policies, procedures, and of ourselves, our hearts. What are we doing? What are we doing in the classroom? Social work and child and family studies relies heavily on field internships, so partnerships in agencies out in the community. And that has been a little bit of a third rail. You don't, you have to play nicely with the agencies out in the community so as not to alienate them, because we need them so much to work with our students. But we are finding the institutional courage this year to be much more assertive in our in conveying our expectations about anti-racism, active anti-racism in the agencies with which we partner, and also diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Cain has been instrumental in talking with us about that this year. And so I impaneled a director's anti-racism advisory committee and said, tell me personally, tell me professionally, tell us, from the perspective of the school, we must do better. We want to do better. We are going to do better. I will say, and Bob, I don't know if your historical perspective runs to this topic, but talk about a political football, and that's the lab schools, no pun intended. But you think those schools are there for laboratory purposes? I'm just going to be bold enough to say that they are there to serve the political class in Louisiana. And I'll, not for lack of courage, but because I'm probably tiptoeing outside of my area of expertise. But boy, we're not going to anytime soon see those units as about diversity and not politics, regrettably.
I hear you there. Dr. Helen Regis has a question about how some universities have gone the route of having a race and reconciliation initiative. Brown University has done a very good job with this, for example, that includes research on the university's own history and current structure. I'll be honest, Helen, I've actually brought that to the attention of the president, and I think maybe some more pressure on that would help. But I'd love to hear the panelists talk about whether they think that's a waste of time or whether that's something that we could be pursuing to actually get some results in the realm of institutional courage.
Jonathan, that I don't know if the panelists know or those who are watching know that there's a bill before the House Education Committee today in which a member from the president of the chairman of the committee from New Orleans is trying to prevent LSU and other schools from teaching critical race theory and just in general teaching about racism in the state from a historical and otherwise perspective. Today he actually said out loud in this committee hearing that he thought that schools like LSU and others need to be teaching the good parts of slavery. So that's what we're up against right now. We're not only being told we can't teach that we shouldn't be teaching about this stuff, but that we should be teaching the positive aspects of slavery. That's where we are in this state. That's why I think the political climate that we exist in has held us back and will continue to hold us back. And I think that every faculty member, first of all, I don't think that bill's constitutional, but I think that every faculty member ought to be looking, if it should pass, become law, I think every faculty member should be looking at ways to very publicly violate it.
I believe, David, that you were at that panel. That's where you were downtown. If you want to speak to this comment and maybe this pending legislation.
Sure. This is why I'm so frazzled. Yeah, I spent 4 hours there and spoke and testified in opposition to the bill. And I'm seeing in the comments that individuals are updating all of us on where the bill stands. When I left to come here, there was a conversation that higher ed institutions will be taken out of the bill and it will be reworked and reintroduced. I don't know, so it's all over the place, but it does send a clear message, and Bob hit on this, is that, and I think you mentioned it early, that we don't value as a state, as a space, do we value science? Do we value education? Do we value critical thinking? Or are we trying to uphold historical systems and racial hierarchy? Institutional courage means calling it out point blank, and then working in opposition to shut down those items. When I spoke on the floor, and I've never been to it was kind of fun for me. It was actually really dramatic. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I've watched C-SPAN. This was way better than that. I could do this all day. So, but what was interesting, when I spoke, I turned around and there were literally a full room of people and said, there are no students here. Yet here we all are with the audacity to speak on behalf of our learners, our young scholars, as though we understand what their needs are based on our limited view of their experience in the global marketplace that will look vastly different than what it looks like today post-COVID. How dare us? And I try to articulate, and this I can only speak to, and I'm gonna kind of borrow this from Dr. Monroe, my own individual experience. I've probably given 20 different talks to churches, elementary schools, and of course, student organizations around LSU. They were like, hey, what's this critical race thing, this intersectionality thing, this community cultural thing? And I've been to fraternities, talk about a space where it takes institutional courage to walk in there and to have an open dialogue about inclusion. Our students are hungry for it. They understand the value in an inclusive society, and they want to be competitive when they graduate. So we have to meet them halfway. I think someone put this on the side, so I don't know if that's going to happen, that the bill will get shelved or will be dismantled. I will say this: we came out from LSU, Betsy, you name it. Folks showed up to really poke holes in how this bill was disastrous and built on fallacy. No one in the state of Louisiana, no large scale organization championed this. As a matter of fact, it was written by the Heritage Foundation. If you all don't know what that is, it's a conservative think tank, not even based in Louisiana. So there's an agenda behind it. And that came to fruition earlier today. So fingers crossed that doesn't move. But what that sends to each of us is a clear message that it's going to take courage if we're going to move forward in a more inclusive way. And I would challenge each and every one of your 47 faces to understand that you have a role to play in that, in your classrooms, in your research, in public spaces, such as the state capitol. Otherwise, Louisiana, who is 49th in education, will remain that way. And I have to tell y'all this, I'm better than that. So I need you all to step in that same space and say, so are we, and so is the next generation. Have the courage to claim that and then do the work for us to shift in the right direction.
Yeah, David, I just want to add that, the time for sitting silent and sitting back and letting other people do the work is over. I see you, we see you, and we're going to call you out.
And I think it is important. I mean, go ahead, Pam.
Yeah, if I could add just another comment. Dr. Stamps has just, in his choice of words, has demonstrated courage, personal, individual, moral, institutional courage when he said, I appeared and spoke in opposition to public employees are always told, when you go to the legislature, be very careful. Bob, tell me if I'm wrong. You be very careful. You speak for information only, right? And then you can say what you need to say, but be careful that you never speak in opposition to or in support of. And so to Dr. Stamp's earlier statement about not complying, this is an example of the courage that it takes not to comply in the face of a putrid statement about teaching the good. I can't even say these words. They can't even sit in my mouth. And so, Dr. Stamps, I want to acknowledge and applaud the good trouble that you create and model by not complying and by speaking in opposition to such an offensive piece of legislation.
And it was nice working with you all.
Dr. Goldgaber has given me about 5 more minutes until we're going to take a brief break and then return for a award presentation and then our keynote. So I'm in your hands, or else I can keep asking questions.
I guess I can jump in, Jonathan, even though I should have typed it in, but I just, Bob Mann really makes it clear that it's politics in the States, and it's always been politics, and the way that LSU uses football for our politicians, no pun intended or pun intended, but so as employees of, we're public employees, what kinds of political action can we engage in or ought we engage in? Like, what is the proper role for faculty as far as like political engagement goes? Because it seems like that's the only thing that that's the kind of pressure we need to bring to bear to see change. And so I think that that's not clear to employees, like what they're able to do as public employees.
I think that non-civil service employees have a lot more freedoms to do and speak out on political issues. No one's ever told me that my activism, and I'm not aware of anybody else on this campus who's been told that speaking out on political issues is not legal or proper. I mean, we do have academic freedom, so I believe we're able to do that. But I think for a lot of people, for a lot of faculty, it's more self-imposed censorship. It's kind of like what David was talking about earlier. I mean, they're worried about tenure and promotion. They're worried about a raise. They're worried about being given the worst courses in their department to teach, or whatever kind of punishment that they're concerned about. I think some of it is within the institution itself and not from the outside.
Yeah, I would just say, Bob, I came on board around 1988, and I was not in the School of Social Work. I'll let you look at my CV and see where I started. Told regularly and in no uncertain terms. Like, I was told at the time I couldn't even put a political yard sign in my yard at home. Now I'm incorrigible, Dr. Stamps. I don't know if that's courage, or I try not to be reckless, but I'm incorrigible. But I absolutely. And so I think and I see Dr. Cain also shaking her head. I think what we're getting at is almost this institutional policing that says to people, oh, don't cross that line, be very careful, because there are laws and you're right, it does apply to civil service, but at the same time, LSU as an institution has been very clear in conveying that message, and not just to folks who are not yet tenured or who have vulnerabilities in their contract, but to all of us, but to especially to folks who are not tenured. And again, I think back to my earlier comment about privilege, I know where my privilege is located and probably could be schooled on other places where my privilege is located. And I'm just determined to acknowledge it and put it into service, not recklessly, but to take risks and put it into service to dismantle injustice. As I know you are, I'm not.
So I'm going to take my colleague Sue Marchand's question and make this the last question with my own kind of twist on it. Her question is pretty straightforward. How do we have a new president pressured to be the leader of a more institutionally courageous LSU? I'll be honest, I know the interim president quite well. I knew the last president pretty well. They were fine folks. I mean, there's a real disconnect between the kind of personal courage that I'm hearing our panel talk about, which I admire and applaud, and there's how do you make an institution have courage? Because that's where I think all this panel agrees. It's a pretty sad history. It's a pretty sad present. And I worry that it's a pretty sad future as well. So that's my kind of closing comment for y'all. I'm going to shut up.
And I think that's where you see the deficiency. You know, you're like, oh, we have this many diverse deans now. We got 2 Black deans. We got a multiracial dean. We do, you know, okay, that looks good right at the top. What's happening to all those 5,000 other people at the bottom? None of this stuff is trickling through the ranks. And people are doing what they want to do. They are doing the same old. And so we have to figure out how to hold these people accountable, whether it's through employee evaluations, faculty evaluation, whatever it is. We need to figure something out. What we're doing now is not working. And what we're doing now, recruiting Black faculty, is not working. What we're doing to make a pipeline for the current students that we are teaching, these PhD students, and I understand people are like, oh, we don't do inbred, but some of these students are wonderful. They are brilliant, and we let them walk away. And we look at our numbers and wonder, how in the heck are we gonna get past 61? We should be at 500 diverse people, 500 Black people. How are we going to make this different? We cannot keep doing the same. We cannot keep crying, oh, but you're an internal candidate or you're inbred. We can't keep you. Figure it out. Other universities do it. We have to be radical with change. And that's it. And we all have to scream it. If we're all screaming it together and we all are pressing and pushing together, we will make change. And the people who are back there, as my mama says, just sharing with people and trying to make this negative impact at LSU, we need to make sure that they know they are not welcome, and we will push you out.
Dr. Goldgaber, I believe we came in on time, unless there's a final word from the panel. Y'all are magnificent. Thank you for taking the time, for your candor, for your individual courage, and may it translate into institutional courage for Louisiana State University. Dr. Goldgaber.
Thank you so much to this excellent panel. I think that we need to keep like a lot of what has been said in our minds as we go for summer break and really try to come back. And, you know, the Ethics Institute is like why we were, I think, why we were institutionalized was in part to like provide some sort of to create these sort of fora and to keep these kinds of conversations going. So we're very committed to doing that. And somebody mentioned that, you know, it's a shame that there's only 43 people here, but like, you know, finals week at the end of a very difficult year and semester, I still think that's a good showing. And I think that unfortunately, like, you know, we're housed in humanities and social sciences. So it's also hard to make those connections with business and law and engineering. And so, and as Sue Marchand notes, 43 can certainly be powerful. So we're going to do our best to extend our connections. I know that there's some engineering folks here, and but we need to do better also to bring faculty across the university together on these issues, because I know we're all thinking about them. And like the question about our political voice, I think is really important. And I hope to come back to that. So it is 2:30. We're going to take about a 10-minute break and come back at 2:40, where we're going to award the 2021 Ethics Institute Inspire Award. And then at 3 o'clock, we're going to have our keynote speaker, Dr. Jennifer Fried. So take a moment to step away and relax. And we thank again our panelists and Dean Earl for a wonderful discussion. Thank you. Powerful.